It's Sunday, July 7, 2024. I'm Anthony Davis. Welcome to the Weekend Show, where we make the time to consider the news of the week. You can support my work and independent journalism at patreon.com/5minutenews. Our guest today is a human rights lawyer who built his career fighting for survivors of domestic violence, asylum seekers, and low-income communities. He ran unsuccessfully for the Democratic nomination for Illinois' 11th Congressional District earlier this year, a primary challenge to seven-term Democratic incumbent Bill Foster. Qasim Rashid, welcome back to the Weekend Show.
Great to be with you, my friend. How are you?
Very good, thank you. I'm thrilled to talk to you. You have, maybe I should ask you first about running for public office, which, it takes a certain character. You've tried 3 times now, right?
That's right.
Tell us very quickly about your desire to do so, especially to try and unseat one of those kind of lifers in that Democratic candidate.
Well, it starts by getting permission from my wife, Aisha. Without that, it wouldn't have happened, and she's extraordinarily supportive. I guess the first lesson is make sure your spouse, your partner, is someone who's going to support you, because without that support, you fail before you even begin. I think at the end of the day, we live in a time where there are systemic injustices, where the status quo in many ways is unbearable. And for me, somebody who is an immigrant, somebody who came from a low-income background, someone who knows what it's like to pay for food with food stamps, live in Section 8 housing, you name it, to be at a place where I am, where I can run, where I have the financial means to run, I consider it an obligation to do what I can. Working as an attorney, supporting people who've been marginalized or underrepresented, there's a certain sense of accomplishment that comes from being an advocate. There's also a deep sense of frustration because advocacy can only go so far. The analogy I always give is if you're in a sinking boat, the advocate is the one who is trying to get a bucket and get the water out of the boat. The policymaker says, hey, we can fix the boat altogether. And so when you've been an advocate for a while, it's rewarding because you're able to support individuals or even a community here and there. But you begin to understand very quickly that there are just systemically unjust fixtures that need to be replaced in our politics. And so in running, it was with that mentality that now it's time to transform my advocacy for human rights into better policy for human rights. That was driving motivation, and that motivation remains.
I suppose as immigrants, I mean, you were born in Pakistan, I was born in the UK, right? So, yeah. And I think getting a perspective of knowing like where you've come from and where you've arrived, it is very interesting, isn't it? That it seems that all the immigrants are so keen to get involved and actually make some noise and shake things up because of that unique perspective. And maybe we don't take things for granted as much, which is frustrating when the rhetoric, especially from MAGA Republicans, is that immigrants are all drug dealers and rapists and we bring crime and we're from mental institutions. Just talk to that if you can.
Well, again, I think, Mark Twain says it best that, every American should travel. Travel is fatal to bigotry. And you look at the data of how few Americans have a passport, even though our passport is literally the access to the world, something that very few people around the world have privilege to, and we don't take advantage of it. All the data, by the way, and you know this, shows that immigrants have lower crime rates, higher vaccination rates. They have lower rates of drug abuse. They have lower rates of even DUIs, you name it. On every social spectrum, if you put 2 people together, one is an immigrant, one is a U.S. citizen, and you didn't tell people which is which, vast majority of time people will pick the immigrant because they don't realize that immigrants are actually not the bane of our existence. And let me be very careful with my words. Immigrants can be U.S. citizens as well. I meant to clarify that immigrants versus people born in the U.S. And that's not to trash people born in the U.S. either. It is to point out that when you look at the history of this country, the first trafficked people, Africans, upon whose back the entire infrastructure of this country was built, And then the first movement of immigrants to build labor unions were Chinese immigrants. And then you saw the initial attacks against Asian immigrants because in the early 1900s, the theme was that Asians were stealing our jobs. A theme that sounds familiar even today, 100 years later, to the ban on immigration in 1924 from Asia and South America and Africa. You see, contrary to the movement against immigrants, how immigrants continue to build and grow and develop this country. And even right now, I was talking to a friend about this just the other day, someone who's a staunch Republican complaining about immigrants. And I said, look, there are 4.5 million vacant jobs in the agricultural industry right now. Are you going to go out and do those agricultural jobs? He goes, well, no, of course not. I'm like, well, then why are you banning the immigrant communities who want those jobs and who are doing them successfully right now? By denying that, you're not only hurting human beings, first and foremost, who happen to be immigrants, but you're also, cutting off your own nose to spite your face. It's this utter stupidity in every sense of the word. And as we see the economy, there's a great study, I think, done by the Washington Post that immigrants have contributed $7 trillion to the economy over the last, I think, a couple of years or decade. Don't quote me the exact numbers, but it was this incredible amount. As we see 10,000 baby boomers retiring a day, and a declining birth rate, do we really think that it's economically wise? If all you care about is money, if you care about nothing else, if you don't care about the human condition and all you care about is money, even then, it is utter stupidity to be anti-immigrant. In fact, you should be the most pro-immigrant person out there because that's right. How this economy is thriving and developing. Yeah.
I suppose it's the same with climate change, isn't it? Like climate change denial, when, that is the economy of our future. And there is no way that we are going to survive the climate crisis unless we get stuck in, all of us, and all benefit. And yet so much of the anti-climate and anti-immigration rhetoric is built on lies. It's not based in truth. It is just weaponized and politicized. It's so short-termist, isn't it? Because there's going to be a huge climate migration if I just kind of fuse those topics. Americans don't even know what's coming when it comes to climate migration.
It's already begun, and it's a few weeks back, my brother-in-law was flying back through Chicago, where I am, and had to stop at my place for a couple of days because he was flying back to Miami, and Miami was flooding, and the waters weren't receding. And so their flights wasn't canceled for a few hours; it was canceled for several days, and it's going to get worse. And to kind of double down on this really important point you made, Anthony, about climate migrants, I think the last 12 months have been the 12 hottest months on record in the last 100 and some years, and that's continuing to get worse. And along the equator, it's going to continue to get worse as well. And these are human beings that have the same needs that everybody else does in other parts of the world, and they're going to move. Be it by force or be it by choice, they're going to move. And so this is why our policies, and when we talk about climate justice, I always see it as a three-pronged approach. And you have to recognize all three. It's not just about climate justice. It's not hugging a tree and saying, save this tree. It's also the social impact as well as the economic impact. The social impact, because we know, and the studies have told us this repeatedly, that the impact of climate change is disproportionately harming the global south, is disproportionately harming low-income communities, Black and brown communities. There's no accident why the life expectancy in a certain part of Chicago is 10 years less than another part of Chicago. And a lot of that has to do with access to something as simple as shade, or having more trees and having a better, oxygen turnout as opposed to carbon dioxide. And you can get into all the science behind it. Statistically speaking, if you're Black or Latino, you're 30% more likely to live next to a toxic waste dump. Why? Because Black and Latino Americans don't have representation in Congress to prevent toxic waste dumps from being built in their backyards. I often go back to the example of the Dakota Access Pipeline in Minnesota, and people were saying, well, what's the big deal for these Native Americans if there's a pipeline built through their lands? Who cares? Well, I'll tell you who cares. The affluent white community, where it was supposed to originally go through, and they said, no, absolutely not. We don't want it here, not in my backyard. Go throw it over there where those indigenous people live. And then suddenly they said, well, what's the big deal? Well, the hypocrisy of it all is the big deal. And so, again, I think, Anthony, you really beautifully said this, that Americans, by not taking this seriously, and the subset of Americans that we can all pretty clearly talk about, who aren't taking this seriously, are going to be in for a rude awakening. And I think we've talked about the boiling frog phenomenon in the past. And my fear is not just the right wing MAGA Republicans, but there's plenty of Democrats not taking this seriously as well in the halls of power. And these are folks who may be older, who may not be around in 40, 50 years, but I hope to be. My children certainly will be. And they're going to suffer the consequences of decisions being made right now over which they'll have no control in the future.
You mentioned Florida. Governor Ron DeSantis, about 6 weeks ago, signed into law, well, he banned climate change, banned any climate policies, actually wrote a bill and signed it off. If this isn't an example of the insanity and the propaganda and also the short-sightedness as well, because, ultimately, as you say, Florida is suffering. It has issues with erosion. We know about the high insurance costs of living there and trying to get insurance because of the lack of policies. I mean, ultimately, Republicans just cutting their noses off to spite their faces, aren't they?
Yes, absolutely. And I would take it a step further, Anthony. And, with Republicans, you can expect their allegiance to corporate influence and corporate power. That's kind of been their status quo from the get-go. It's always been, their focus is on protecting capital and their wealth, and I got mine, so screw you. That's kind of been the mentality since the get-go. Even now, we're seeing how the Republican Party, who unanimously voted against extending the child tax credit, who unanimously blocked free school lunches for children, who watched as childhood poverty increased by 30% as a result, now suddenly ban IVF because they're pro-life. Right? Just the absurdity that actual children starving are not worth supporting, but a clump of cells, no, that's a human being that we need to protect, right? So the whole focus is backwards. But I'll tell you, and I'll probably take some heat from the left on this, but my frustration is with corporate-funded Democrats who know better, who run on these issues of, campaign finance reform or climate justice, but then they'll take money from fossil fuel corporations, or they'll promote fracking or offshore drilling as if it doesn't matter when they do it. And so that's my whole focus right now, that, with Republicans, at the very minimum, you get what you pay for. They're going to screw you over. They're going to do what's best for their stock portfolio and for their bank accounts. Democrats are supposed to be, allegedly, better. And most are. But there's enough, like the Joe Manchins of the world, and I'll even throw in the Hillary Clintons of the world, who are so aligned with corporate interests and they refuse to let go of power or influence, that is stunting the ability for our party to grow and bring in new talent and a new generation to actually address these issues that are going to be affecting us. And look, I'll just bring, I brought up Hillary. I hope she lives a long and healthy life. I hope she lives as long as, the good Lord allows her to live. But in 60 years, she's not going to be around to suffer the consequences of the actions that she's taking right now. My kids will. My grandkids will. And it's unfortunate to me that we see young people, in their 20s, 30s, who are extraordinarily talented, just being blocked out, 40s being blocked out. That's going to come back and haunt us aggressively in the short term and the long term.
So I take the point about Hillary Clinton, but this is a problem kind of across the United States with regard to capitalism and the way the country has been born, really. I mean, it is corporate interests, it is finance, it is wealth, and so many of the landmark moments in history through civil rights and freeing the slaves. I mean, these things happened for financial reasons often, because there was an economic reason behind it, and I think sometimes people forget that in the detail you just have to follow the money train, and eventually you'll see the real reason behind it. Do you think that's a fair assessment?
Completely, yeah, and it's why we see things like Citizens United getting passed, because corporations began to realize, hey, we don't have the kind of influence that we need to have. And you look back at the 2006 Voting Rights Act, that was passed by George Bush, by an overwhelming House majority, by a near unanimous Senate vote. In fact, I think it was unanimous. It might have been 98-0 or 98-1 or something like that. And then a Republican president signs it into law. And 2 years later, the scariest thing in the world happens. A black guy becomes president. And you saw for the first time in history, voter turnout of black voters that exceeded white voter turnout. And I always say that you can tell that's such a good litmus test where you can tell how just there's a massive shift in the two parties' worldview at that point, because the HR1 or the John Lewis Voting Rights Act, or the For the People Act, when these bills were proposed to codify those voting rights after the Supreme Court gutted them in 2013 in Shelby versus Holder, you see an almost carbon copy of the 2006 bill. And rather than seeing the continued unanimous support once more, you see a massive split where Democrats, by and large, with the exceptions of Manchin and Sinema and a couple of really right-wing Democrats like that, by and large are unanimous in saying, yeah, we still need to protect these voting rights. Republicans are like, no, we fell for that trap once. We can't allow this trap to continue where, black and brown people have access to voting in an easy way. We still got to make it difficult. And one of the ways they made it difficult is through passing, Citizens United. I think I read a statistic where in the presidential election before Citizens United was passed, billionaires spent something like $20 million on elections, which is a lot of money. But already in this presidential election, they've spent more than $500 million. And it's going to get even more expensive in the next 3 or 4 months as well. And so to me, I think you really summed it up. It's a question of what is going to ensure economic and financial viability for these uber wealthy who already have more wealth than any people in the history of this country have had.
Right. I never understand that. What are they going to spend it on, Qasim?
I think they think it's going to make them immortal. I think they think they're going to live forever, and that somehow they'll hit some technology that will allow them to transfer their brain to a computer. I don't know. But what I do know is that there's no reason why in a country that is the wealthiest in the world, 1 in 6 children need to be food insecure. 80% of Americans can't afford a $600 emergency. 60%, 70% live paycheck to paycheck. This is all absurd, and it's manufactured. And it's because of the point you made where we have such a focus on wealth that we don't look at the equality or the equity that comes with it. And if 700 billionaires being super wealthy means 60 million Americans have to live in poverty, so be it. That's fundamentally a problem.
Poverty is not a word that I really hear talked about in American politics very much. In England, it's a big thing because most of the country, despite working, live in relative poverty. We refer to the working poor. But here, there's a lot of talk of the middle classes, and, Joe Biden does that. The middle class is this, the middle class is that. And I understand that conceptually it's aspirational. But what you describe about debt and about, the inability to clothe or feed, the rise in food banks, this is the reality, isn't it? And yet maybe there's something about American culture and exceptionalism that really doesn't want to admit that maybe in some ways, at least socially, the experiment has failed.
When you look at, and I go back to the data every single time, and when you look at the greatest growth of the middle class between 1940 and 1980, that span, you saw a couple of really significant things happen. You saw us come out of the Great Depression in significant part by the New Deal as well as World War II. But you also saw a massive proper allocation of wealth. The top wealthiest people paid up to a 94% marginal tax rate. There was an upper income limit. And for people who may not understand the term marginal tax, that doesn't mean that you paid 94% of your income. It means once you hit a certain threshold, I think at the time it was like $2 million whatever the number was, it might have been 10 million, but whatever the number was, every dollar beyond that, you paid a 94% marginal tax. So you made your first 10 million taxed at a normal rate, and then beyond that, you paid a much higher rate. And guess what? You saw the middle class grow to be 62% of the country. You saw the ability of a single family income to afford a house, a car, pay for education, pay for food, pay for groceries, have a pension, for God's sake. You saw an explosion of the housing market. Now, granted, that was still based in Jim Crow white supremacy because the FHA only made those loans towards white families, not to Black communities. That's why we have redlining and the legacy of redlining. Nonetheless, you did see it grow. Even the GI Bill went to white families only, not to Black soldiers. And after the fall of Jim Crow in the 1960s, you began to see that upward trend happen. The reaction to that, the backlash to all that, was the Southern strategy. It was Nixon, it was Reagan, it was the welfare queen trope. And unfortunately, that has been extraordinarily effective. The marginal tax rate was slashed from the 90 percentile to 70 percentile down to, I think at one point under Trump, it was in 21%. You saw a massive restriction on social welfare programs because now Black and brown people had access to them, and suddenly now it's socialism and communism. You saw a rise of mass incarceration targeting Black communities. Even to this day, Black and Latino communities are charged or arrested at rates of 6 to 10 times more of white communities for the exact same crimes and given 20% longer prison sentences. You had these cruel policies that, well, if you get convicted of a felony, guess what? You can't get food stamps. You can't get Section 8 housing. You can't get federal financial aid, which reinforces and pushes people back into destructive habits. It's why we have double the recidivism rate of developed countries around the world. And so when I hear you say, is this a failed experiment? I think there's a lot of arguments that can make that case pretty strongly. I'm the eternal optimist who refuses to say that it's a failed experiment, who will say that we know what a proven model looks like. We know how to ensure there's meaningful allocation of wealth where the super wealthy pay their fair share. Because I'll tell you what, during that phase between 1940 and 1980, where we saw this massive growth of the middle class, the rural electrification, the rural highway system be built out, you didn't see billionaires leave the country. You didn't see major industry leave the country. You didn't see people say, well, you're taxing me too much, I'm going to leave and go to China. No, that happened after those taxes were cut down significantly, right? And so the whole aspect of it is backwards right now. And for us to get back, it's going to require, I don't even like using the word tough choices, because these aren't tough choices. It's going to require centering humanity over corporate profits for the very top 1%. If we can do that, we can solve 90% of the issues that are out there right now.
It's more of an integrated approach. And I guess being more aware of how America has changed and celebrating our differences rather than weaponizing them.
Yeah.
We have to take a quick break. I want to come back, though, and talk about the separation of church and state, which really does kind of lodge itself in this argument. We'll do that next here on The Weekend Show. Lumen is the world's first handheld metabolic coach. It's a device that measures your metabolism through your breath. And on the app, it lets you know if you're burning fat or carbs and gives you a tailored guidance to improve your nutrition, workout, sleep, and even stress management. All you have to do is breathe into your Lumen first thing in the morning, and you'll know what's going on with your metabolism. Then Lumen gives you a personalized nutrition plan for that day based on your measurements. You can also breathe into it before and after workouts and meals, so you know exactly what's going on in your body in real time. And Lumen will give you tips to keep you on top of your health game. Because your metabolism is at the center of everything your body does. Optimal metabolic health translates to a bunch of benefits, including easier weight management, improved energy levels, better fitness results, and better sleep. So, if you want to take the next step in improving your health, go to lumen.me/weekend to get 15% off your Lumen. That's lumen.me/weekend for 15% off your purchase. Thank you, Lumen, for sponsoring this episode. We're back on the weekend show with Qasim Rashid. The new Speaker of the House, he's not actually that new anymore, he's been in for a while. He is a man of faith, a man of God, some might say an extreme version of Christianity. But, I'm not one to judge. However, he has said that the separation of church and state is a misnomer, and he spent the better part of the last 2 decades advocating for religious freedom in public schools, in government, and in public spaces. And recently we also had Louisiana challenging the lie of so-called separation of church and state as they described it. I mean, this is becoming a real salient point, because I think people just kind of took for granted that they were separate. And now you get these kind of MAGA extremists holding very central positions in government, such as Speaker, second in line to the presidency. It starts to become a problem.
I was looking down at my notes. I read this quote by Mark Twain earlier today that I love. He's one of my favorite satirists, and his commentary on religion always leaves me in stitches. And this quote of his, he goes, "Blasphemy, no, it is not blasphemy. If God is as vast as that, he is above blasphemy. If he is as little as that, he is beneath it." And I think this applies so well over here that if you need to pass legislation to protect your God, it's not God you're protecting, it's your ego. And if you have that little view of God that he can't protect himself, then that's not a God that deserves to be worshipped in the first place. At the end of the day, there's, again, a lot of misinformation about the founders of this country, as flawed as they were, and I'm the first to criticize them. They were deists. They were not religious fanatics. They were not evangelicals. They were not zealots, priests on a divine mission. They established this American experiment explicitly with the separation of religion and state. And I say this as somebody who is an observant Muslim, as somebody who does believe in God, that any government that is set up as a theocracy is destined to fail. Because you cannot enforce morality. You cannot enforce religion. What you can enforce is equal access to justice under the law. Right? Simple as that. Provide equal access, provide freedom of conscience, freedom of expression, freedom of access, and let people decide based on what their conscience tells them is the right or moral approach. And this is what I tell conservatives of every faith. If you don't like gay marriage, don't get gay married. Right? If you don't like abortion, don't get an abortion. If you don't like alcohol being prevalent, don't drink alcohol. Right? These are all things that are on the spectrum of what is and is not moral. And if something offends you in that respect, as long as my behavior is not impacting you, you have no right to dictate what my behavior should be. That's the general rule here. And and I think it's a two-way street. We don't want religious people dictating to government what is and is not moral in our personal lives. Likewise, we don't want government dictating to churches and mosques and synagogues what their moral teachings should and should not be. They're private institutions. And so that two-way street to me is sacred because it allows government to serve as a standard bearer of secularism and justice, to provide equal access to all people and all ideas, and allows people of faith to live without oppression or restriction and say, hey, my faith says that an abortion is immoral and wrong. Great. You don't get abortions, period. Somebody else's faith says that, no, they're acceptable and they're okay, and they have access. And that's the beauty of a country that ensures separation of religion and state. What we're seeing happening in the United States is, unfortunately, we have examples of other nations that have done this, that were founded on the principles of secular governance, separation of religion and state, and allowed those to mix. And we see the devastating consequences. I'm hopeful that we can push back against that. But it's a one-way street. And that's the part I want to emphasize. In the past, when governments have fused religion and state, it's a one-way street. There's no going back from that. And that's the scary part.
A lot of it happens by stealth as well.
Sure.
And in fact, things like the appeal to heaven flag, which we've seen Mike Johnson have outside of his office, and the Federalist Society chairman Leonard Leo flies that flag, and interestingly, so does Martha Ann Alito, Samuel Alito's wife, flies the appeal to heaven flag. I mean, this is what I'm talking about. It reminds me a little bit of, of like the Klan not wanting to show their face, hiding under white hoods. There is this dog whistle, whether it be in the form of a flag, or whether it be in the form of a white power symbol, or whether it be in the form of just the extremist form of political preaching that we see in evangelical churches up and down the country. That politics is now so infused with religion that I'm sure there is a generation of people who will grow up to think that they are one of the same.
Yes, and I think the proof is in the audacity with which they're no longer doing it by stealth. It was some time ago, maybe 15 years ago, 20 years ago. I still recall George W. Bush saying that God told him to invade Iraq as a crusade. That was a dog whistle, right? Yes. That was a pretty clear dog whistle in that sense. And now you have these overt statements by Trump saying, we're going to kick out anybody who doesn't like our religion and doesn't want to be part of our religion. They're going to be gone. And the irony of somebody who, by all accounts, is probably an atheist, who probably has never picked up the Bible in his entire life. And if he does, he picks it up upside down. Who can't quote a single Bible verse. And I think that where we are now, they're telling us what their intentions are. They're being open and explicit about it. And we should take them seriously because, again, losing this battle to maintain a secular democratic republic, this is not a battle that we can afford to lose. It is a one-way street.
Do you think that MAGA Republicans and associated lawmakers can understand the complexities of somebody who is a practicing Muslim really getting behind the separation of church and state? You see what I mean? Like the idea of like leaving your beliefs in the foyer and coming into the rotunda with a separate view of how government should run. Because it requires us to be selfless. It requires us to understand the concept of collective responsibility. And I just fear that the subtlety, the critical thinking required, and the selflessness required for people of faith to be pushing the separation of church and state as a concept is something that these MAGA people can't understand.
Well, I always go back to it's a hijacking of Christianity in that sense, right? I mean, Jesus famously said, render unto Caesar what is Caesar's and unto God's what is God's, right? I mean, to me, that's a very explicit statement that certain things in God's domain, leave it with God, certain thing in government's domain, leave it to government and keep the two separate and don't let them fuse. And, some evangelical is going to listen to this and send me an angry email saying, how dare you talk about Jesus, not realizing that Muslims love Jesus as well. It's a different conversation altogether.
Yeah.
But no, I don't think they recognize that because I don't think they're actually upholding Christianity. I think they're using this as a vehicle for power, a vehicle for control.
Control, yeah.
That's really what I find. And the reason why I know that is because if you go to countries like Pakistan, my birth country, you've got the mullahs and the sheikhs there doing the same thing with the Quran and saying, well, the Quran says this, so this is what our constitution should be based off of. When in reality, if they just practiced their faith on their own and didn't worry about anyone else, that is the focus that the Quran calls them to do when it mandates a separation of religion and state as well. So to me, it's a focus on power, and it's specifically a focus by wealthy, arrogant men on power. They're kind of the root causes of a lot of this, unfortunately. And for us to be able to counter that is going to require a multi-faith, multi-ethnic, across the socioeconomic class coalition of people saying, hey, let's recognize, and I think you said this beautifully earlier, let's recognize, even celebrate our differences. Let's respect our differences. Let's respect each other's moral standards if they differ, but recognize that we need to be united on this principle that if we don't have secular government, none of this matters at all. If the only way we rule is might is right, then it's perpetual war, it's perpetual fighting, and that's just not a sustainable way to live. I think if we can build that kind of a coalition, we can get somewhere. Short of that, we're in trouble.
But it goes against all of the policies of the right and the religious right and the Republican Party, or the party of Trump as it has become. You know, all of those things you describe are not things that will ever pass through the lips of those people. Right. Because they don't consider that it's even an arena with which they can play in. Maybe because they don't have the language or the empathy or even the interest, you know, and that is my concern. I actually personally believe that we need to stop talking about how polarized America is and start talking, as you just have, about the actual detail. Because I think when you get people on a one-on-one, that we actually would surprisingly agree on a whole lot. It's just sometimes the definitions and the language and the delivery that keeps us apart.
Sure. I think there's an extent to that's absolutely part of it. When I was running for office, I knocked on Republican doors as well. And I had plenty of my neighbors who were Republican come out and support me and put my lawn signs out or yard signs out on their lawn and everything. And it's because I had the conversation with them. And I think you're exactly right. I'm going to bring up Hillary Clinton again in a second.
Your favorite.
Where I think we run into a problem. I think you're exactly right that, you know, a lot of these MAGA politicians just aren't willing to have a dialogue. They don't really care. And there's enough of a core base, maybe 30% of the country, that you could tell them anything and it's just not going to matter. But that's why it's so much more frustrating when you have someone like Hillary Clinton endorsing a MAGA Trump-funded challenger to a Democratic incumbent, right? That's just wild to me, right? I mean, Jamal Bowman's opponent has made Islamophobic comments, racist comments. He's well funded by the same people that gave tens of thousands of dollars to Donald Trump as he defeated Hillary Clinton. And Hillary, rather than supporting the incumbent, who is very anti-Trump, is supporting the guy funded by the people of Trump. And so if you are a young person and you're looking at this, you're seeing, well, it's just the same party then. You're saying that, so we voted out the Republican guy, we've got a Democratic guy in there, and now one of the leaders of the Democratic Party is bringing in a MAGA guy? Like, what is going on here? And that's where my frustration is with the current status quo, that, and I'm going to sound like a broken record, but, you know, we expect MAGAs to do these nut job things, but we expect Democrats to be able to rise above and say, no, you know, I may not agree with everything that this fellow Democrat says, but they're not a mega Republican, so I'm going to get behind them. But then lo and behold, they're not. And I experienced this when I ran for Congress against Bill Foster. You know, Bill Foster comes off as, well, I'm a scientist, I'm a PhD physicist, all true. But then he supports fracking, and he supports offshore drilling. He's funded by Exxon. He's funded by BlackRock. He's funded by the same corporations that are funding insurrectionists. He opposes guaranteed health care. He's voted to strip down disability rights. I mean, for God's sake, this man attacked people with disabilities and said people with disabilities have too much freedom in this country. We need to knock them down a size. He's funded by the same MAGA Republicans that are undermining our democracy. And that's one reason why I ran against him. Now, I was not successful, but that is the frustration that I think the next generation looks at in saying, what are we supposed to do at this point? If the MAGA Republicans are explicitly anti-democracy, and you've got enough, not all, but enough people in the Democratic Party, like the Bill Fosters, who are implicitly anti-democracy, where do we go from here?
If I could provide an explanation, and it just occurred to me, but the issue is not so much these candidates, but it's more big money in politics. And the fact that in order to get elected, you need to raise an awful lot of money.
100%.
And that is something that is pretty unique to the United States. in terms of how, success is measured by wealth, and then that connects into a political campaign as well. And the limits on campaign contributions, there's all loopholes and various things. And then you can have, you can set up your organization to circumnavigate various rules. I mean, it's so frustrating that, because money, I mean, the politicians in the UK, sorry to keep mentioning it, but, they get like a flat rate of not a huge salary.
Yeah.
And they are, apart from some of the conservatives who have like, historical wealth, most people are really struggling. These are politicians, they are struggling. It's important, isn't it, to get money out of politics, to get the lobbying out of politics. But, once the toothpaste is out of the tube, I really think it would be very difficult to get it back in this country.
Well, and that's just the case with Citizens United, that allowed effectively unlimited campaign contributions in one way or another.
Yeah.
And the reason why I very deliberately chose, Bill Foster and Hillary Clinton as the two examples that to me are most outrageous, is because these are people worth 20, 30, 40, $50 million, right? They don't need the money. They're choosing to do this, right? Hillary's not running for office. She doesn't have a dog in the fight in that sense, right? Nothing bad is going to happen to her if Jamal Bowman wins re-election, as he should.
But she does have a social conscience, though, doesn't she? I mean, she was the one, just to kind of fight her corner for a little bit, just because she doesn't have the right of reply.
Yeah.
I mean, she told us who Donald Trump was before he ran. She's been very consistent with her views on the fall of American democracy, if he is given an inch, let alone a mile.
Right.
And she really has stuck with that. But the problem is that, she is part of a dynasty, isn't she? And these political dynasties, whether it be Clintons or Bushes or Kennedys, they are kind of unhealthy for kind of public office.
They're unhealthy, but Anthony, I think your first point was even more powerful. You're right. She did warn us of the harms of MAGA extremism, but that makes it all the more perplexing that she would endorse a candidate funded by MAGA extremists, right? And Bill Foster, he warns all the time about the harms of MAGA extremism, which makes it all the more perplexing that he takes absurd amounts of money, millions of dollars, from the same corporations and entities that fund MAGA extremists. And so that's what I mean, that we really need a reckoning on the Democratic side, where the commitment has to be to justice. It has to be to campaign finance, not just with lip service, but with action. And people like Jamal Bowman, by the way, led by example, doesn't take corporate money, doesn't take dark PAC money. And he got elected the right way. And despite being elected the right way, now he's being undermined by the same entities that take the corporate and dark PAC money,
yes,
dragging us backwards. So what I take comfort in is, despite Republicans and Democrats, there's a really strong sense of unity among Americans to get corporate and dark money out of politics. I've talked to the staunchest MAGA Republicans, especially when I was running for Congress, and they said, you know what? I disagree with you on a lot, but the fact that you're not funded by corporations, I know I can trust you, so therefore you have my vote. I've talked to centrist Democrats, very progressive Democrats, and that was a consistent answer I got across. And so for me, that's the exciting part. That's where I see hope. That's where I see progress, that this is an area where we have general agreement, because at the end of the day, Americans know whoever writes your campaign re-election check is who you're going to be accountable to. And you're smart enough to know that if you're a Republican or a Democrat or somewhere in between, independent. And I think if we can keep pushing forward that initiative, we can start to see some progress, hopefully in the short term, but definitely in the long term as well.
I mean, a lot of this goes back to Reagan, doesn't it? Where, the banks were pulling the strings, and him being an actor. There's this very famous video, isn't there, of him on the balcony making a speech, and one guy whispers in his ear, "Speed it up a bit," and that guy was like the head of a major bank. I mean, who tells the president to speed it up a bit? You know what I mean? So it's undoubtedly the biggest problem, but it just does seem to me that every avenue that I go down on this subject, the door that I open at the end of the street has got like piles of cash in it, or it's a door marked racism. It's like, these are the two doors that I am facing.
Yeah.
Is there a connection between these two? Because, and maybe we could use your attempts at election as examples. You as a Muslim, an outward Muslim looking like a Muslim, and we know some Americans may have a prejudice on your visual. They might not know I was British until I spoke, but you're wearing it on the outside. So how does that play for someone like you seeking public office, and has it held you back, or has it actually been of benefit in any way?
Well, it's certainly been used to attack me, and I've run against Republicans and Democrats, and both have used it to attack me. And some are more explicit. Bill Foster was more subtle, but he used words like radical and dangerous. Not from here. All dog whistle racist terms that a white supremacist would use as well. And so it's unfortunate that he would engage in that kind of rhetoric. So that's definitely been used. What I will say is that even though I'm not running for office right now, I still get the racist remarks. I've had to testify in federal court against the man who wanted to kill me for my faith. So that's kind of all been there, and it's going to continue, unfortunately. The way I see it, though, at the end of the day, is here's an opportunity I have to provide not just leadership through serving my community and leading by example, but really revive kind of the core of this country. I'm obviously not African, but up to 30% of Africans enslaved were Muslim. And so I have that connection from a faith perspective to the people who really built the core of this country. I study Civil War history, and one of my favorite stories is Captain Muhammad Khan, also known as John Amamil, who was a Muslim immigrant from Persia, modern-day Iran, who fought with the Union Army, was a prisoner of war, escaped, and he's got a brilliant story of how he ended up helping the Union win the Civil War and then retired with full pension. One of two Muslim soldiers who retired with full pension. He's buried in Brooklyn, New York. And so for me, it's about sharing these stories and elevating these stories that Muslims are not alien to America. They're not unique to America. The month of Ramadan has been celebrated for centuries in this country. It's not something new that just started with the White House iftar dinner a couple of presidents ago. Thomas Jefferson had an iftar dinner way back when. And so the more I think we talk about these stories and narratives and talk about how Muslims and Islam are immersed in the fabric of what this country is, the fact that Muslims were here before here was America, is a narrative that is not only true, but needs to be espoused more often and more regularly and more consistently. And in my experience, when we have those conversations, we are able to build more bridges of understanding, of dialogue, and to harken back to a really thoughtful comment you made earlier, we're able to celebrate our differences in a meaningful, authentic way, as opposed to some kind of a tokenized way.
It's so interesting, isn't it, how the opportunity to say these things is so rarely available in the political discourse or even in news media. The actual opportunity to have these specific conversations, because I still think that Muslims and people of color generally are suffering off the back of the effect of 9/11, when anybody who wasn't a white American was basically blamed for the attack on the Twin Towers. And I was just thinking while you were saying that about that campaign to stop it was an Islam teaching establishment to being built like nearby Ground Zero. It wasn't a mosque. It was
like a community center.
Community center. And that went on, that kind of argument went on for years, and it just lacked any understanding or critical thinking. So when you are out and about, how much is left over from, because that's 25 years ago, left over from that, do you feel?
I don't think it ever actually went away, because you saw, the first decade after 9/11. I was a second year college student when 9/11 happened. For the first decade, if I gave a public speech anywhere and didn't start with "I condemn 9/11," it was like reciting, your name. Hi, my name's Qasim. I'm a Muslim. I condemn 9/11. Let me talk to you about the weather, right? I mean, it was just ridiculous, right? You had to kind of. Then you had the rise of Obama, and thus Obama is a secret Muslim, and the
Barack Hussein Obama.
Barack Hussein, yeah, emphasis on the Hussein
yeah.
Obama, and his Kenyan Muslim father, and you kind of had that emphasis. And then you had the rise of the anti-Sharia legislation. People forget that more than 24 states tried to pass legislation banning Sharia law, which is just, I think the New York Times called it a solution without a problem, right? That it was made up propaganda. You also had a massive coordinated opposition to building. You mentioned the community center near Ground Zero, but just to building mosques in general. And the irony of that is that you have this bill called the Religious Land Use and Institutionalized Persons Act, which is a fancy name that conservatives passed to prevent municipalities from blocking churches from being built. And the irony of all that is that the faith community that's used it most are first Muslims and then Jews, being opposed by conservatives for building their mosques and their synagogues. And so you kind of saw this perpetuation of it. And then I think with Donald Trump and the Muslim ban, you've kind of seen this, continuation of it. And even now, given what's happening in Gaza, given what's happened in Syria over the years, what's happening in Sudan, you're seeing a perpetuation of their Muslim lives, so they don't really matter as much. You see this dismissal, this kind of less than, this otherizing. Even, the Afghan withdrawal and the Ukraine, the invasion of Ukraine happened around the same time, and you saw how Ukrainian refugees were fast-tracked, brought here and given 3 years to apply for asylum or what have you. But Afghan refugees had to pull, it's like pulling teeth to get a single person over. I worked with about 40 to 45 families, and I was emailing Senator Kane's office and going back and forth and running around like a madman. When in reality, it should have been, if anything, it should have been the other way around. But we saw our U.S. foreign policy very racially defined, very religiously defined in that space as well. And by the way, it's under a Democratic administration, so it's not just a Republican thing too. So for me, all that backdrop to say, for me, the most effective way I believe I can play a role in this is just to be my authentic self. I don't hide my Muslimness. I don't push it in front of people and, start with Assalamu alaikum with every person I'm talking to, right? As cool as that would be. But I think just being my authentic and genuine and sincere self, not, putting a muzzle on myself and not trying to get in other people's business, it's allowed me to build a really thoughtful and meaningful brand, to use a corporate term for a second, where people know what they get. They know what to expect. And for me, the most rewarding part of it is when someone says, hey, I feel comfortable asking you this question that I wouldn't feel comfortable asking in public. And sometimes those questions are really thoughtfully worded, and sometimes they're just blunt. And that's a pretty racist way to ask the question. But I appreciate that they preface it by saying, I feel like this is a safe space, because that tells me they're extending the olive branch to want to learn. And rather than me sitting here and saying, Anthony, how dare you ask that question in that way? My response is, Anthony, I'm so glad you took the time to ask. Let me provide my perspective and we can build from there.
I should also say that 17 of the 19 9/11 bombers were Saudi nationals, and the US sells hundreds of millions of dollars worth of arms to Saudi Arabia all the time. Right. And that really, I suppose, is the irony of this, isn't it? That, again, you take the corridor, open the door, piles of cash. Right. Okay, listen, we have to take another quick break, but I want to come back and talk about hate speech versus free speech, and more specifically, your online post, where you highlight your hate mail of the week. We'll do that next here on The Weekend Show. Living a more heart-healthy life fuels everything you do. Introducing 3-in-1 blood pressure support plus COQ10 from Superbeats Heart Chews Advanced. Paired with a healthy lifestyle, the grapeseed extract in Superbeats is clinically shown to be nearly 2 times more effective at promoting normal blood pressure than a healthy lifestyle alone. New Superbeats Heart Chews Advanced support healthy COQ2 levels, an important nutrient for your heart health. COQ10 generates 95% of the cellular energy that your heart needs, but it can decline with age, stress, and statin use. Heart-healthy energy can now come without the crash. Superbeats Heart Chews also support healthy circulation without stimulants. Find out how you can get a free 30-day supply on bundles of new Superbeats Heart Chews Advanced and save 15% for a limited time only by going to superbeatsradio.com and use the promo code WEEKEND. That's super, BEETS, radio.com with the promo code WEEKEND. We're back with Qasim Rashid here on The Weekend Show. I'm Anthony Davis. Hate speech and free speech are in the US. I mean, everything comes under the First Amendment, right? So people can kind of say what they like without much in the way of consequences. Where I'm from, it doesn't work like that. We don't have a First Amendment. If you are abusive to somebody online or in person and they complain about it, then they'll be investigated. And I've grown up with that, so I don't really see it as a limitation, but I do see the protections that it offers. You talked earlier about, what you have to deal with. And when I was enjoying your social media, I saw that you are posting a hate mail of the week. I mean, it's not a very savory topic, but it is important to call people out. So I just thought maybe we could talk to that and just explain to me maybe the types of people that haven't really kind of kept up with an integrated society, or even how the world has already changed.
And the week is WEAK.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Good use of language.
Because I think at the end of the day, if you have to resort to hate mail or hate messaging to get your point across, it's weak-minded.
Yes.
A great man once said that any faith, any ideology that needs the sword to prove itself needs no other argument for its falsification, because it cuts its own throat before reaching others. And that's really the kind of the way I view this kind of vitriolic hate mail, calling me the sand N-word, calling me Osama, telling me to go back to the Middle East, not from the Middle East, and the list just goes on and on. And as I write, the preface is really, I want folks to understand the realities of life. And I'm fortunate to have a sizable platform. I'm fortunate to have a thriving community of people who read my content and share my content. And it's valuable to me that the folks who support me see things through my eyes in a very direct way as well, for 2 reasons. One, I hope it reinforces to them how important they are to uplifting the conversation and being positive, that they're not just another statistic, another dot in the crowd, that them sharing and having these dialogues and conversations really does make a difference, because it pushes back against the negativity. And 2, I want them to not be insulated from the reality of what they might face when they come out and speak publicly about these issues of combating racism and anti-Semitism and Islamophobia and misogyny and homophobia and xenophobia, all the phobias out there. That this is a realistic response, but you can't let it deter you. You can't let it intimidate you. And rather than simply just being not racist, being actively anti-racist. That's been an extraordinarily rewarding experience, because it's so interesting. I write a new piece almost every single day on some contemporary issue. And every now and then something will go viral and get 20,000 retweets or likes or shares or 100,000 likes. But inevitably, whenever I push out the hate mail of the week, there's an overwhelming response. And it's very positive as well, because I think people do want to play an active role. I think people are genuinely good. I'm a hopeless optimist that people are genuinely good. And it's a way for them to express that positivity. So I love it. I'm going to keep doing that. As long as people keep sending me hate mail, I'll keep leveraging that as an opportunity to build bridges of dialogue and understanding.
I get it as well. I should point that
I'm
out.
sure.
I
Yeah.
got told to drink cyanide recently, which was
Sorry.
nice, and
Horrible.
that some reference to my mother being a prostitute and some other stuff. And I, you know, I was on the radio for years in England, and we used to get all sorts of things sent through. You know, people think they know you because they hear you every day or every night, and so I am able to like separate it completely from my reality. But you know, sometimes something will slip through that really does hurt, and people, you know, maybe I'm naive, but I didn't really realize quite how evil some people could be, and I'm very interested as to where that comes from. Because, you know, obviously we talk about the polarization and we talk about the division in the United States, but I don't just think it's Republicans and Democrats. I actually put it down to good people and bad people, and you can be on either camp with either of those roles. So talk to me about this kind of notion of the, you know, what type of a person would you have to be to write to somebody who was trying to do good and tell them to drink cyanide? I mean, it has to come from a place of darkness, surely.
I have an interesting theory that you may completely dismiss, and I think you'd be justified because I think intelligent minds can disagree. I have this really interesting theory that whether somebody sends you a message that says, Anthony, I think you are God's gift to humanity, versus somebody sending you a message as horrific as drink cyanide, that it actually comes from the same ultimate motivation. And that is self-preservation. The person who thinks you're God's gift to humanity, and I would argue they're right in that perspective, is saying that, you know what, this person is doing something really good for me. And I feel validated. And I need to let him know so that for my own self-edification, I feel good about pushing something positive out there because I feel safer and better that way. Hopefully he puts out more content, he makes more advocacy, he talks about these issues that I care about, and that I, Qasim, will feel better because I saw somebody who's doing good work and I'm reinforcing them. Versus, I think I don't like immigrants, I don't like people who wear black blazers. Let me call Anthony and tell him how terrible of a person he is, so he knows he better not threaten me again, and therefore I feel safer and better about myself too. And so that's why even when I get the nastiness, you know, I try to see if there's ways to leverage it in a positive way. And I have this term I call collateral education, where the person who's being vitriolic or a troll or a bigot or whatever, you know, phrase you want to use may not be willing to have the dialogue or understand. But for every one person like that, there's many others who may have had that thought and just don't know how to respond to it. And if I can respond to it in a way that disarms other people, then for me, that's a huge win. And one example I can give you is the second time I ran for office, this was about 4 or 5 years ago. Somebody sent me a really nasty Islamophobic message to leave the country, just all sorts of nonsense. And I was about to just ignore and move on, but I happened to check the profile on Twitter and saw that they have a GoFundMe for crushing medical debt. I happen to believe that medical debt is immoral, it's wrong, it's completely contrary to our humanity. And so I donated some money, a small amount, 50, 60 bucks. And I tweeted out to, I think, my then maybe 200,000 Twitter followers. And I said, this person hates me for my faith as a Muslim, but my faith teaches service to all humanity. So I've donated money to his GoFundMe, and if you can, please do. Within 24 hours, the GoFundMe was filled, $25,000, $30,000 raised, his medical debt wiped out. And to me, the rewarding part was not him calling me and thanking me, because it was never about him. It was the literally, Anthony, 10,000 plus messages I got, email, text, DMs from people saying, I didn't know what Islam was or what Muslims believe, but if this exemplifies that, then you have me in your corner to always combat and push back against Islamophobia. That to me was the win. And to further emphasize how important of a win that was, the part of the story that people don't know is that that same person about a month later started to send me nasty, racist, Islamophobic messages again. And I wasn't able to get through to him. I just wasn't able to, unfortunately. But for me, the win was the fact that so many more other folks were able to build a strong bridge and a strong dialogue. And I've made friends since that day as a result of that interaction. So that's kind of the way I look at it, that even if someone is sending something hateful, there's always something good that we can develop. Even if it's not the individual, hopefully we can use that to educate the masses who will be much more involved or engaged or willing to have that dialogue. And then they can influence their circle, and we have a positive ripple going that way.
The problem, I guess, is people are often led by example. And when the disgraced former president is the one who is being abusive towards Muslims, people of color, or immigrants, then it's the only time that trickle down actually works, unfortunately. And we've seen it with people like Rashida Tlaib in Congress, and or the Squad, as they've been called, and they've, all of them, Ilhan Omar, they've all been the victim of so much hate and abuse, and it hasn't come just from constituents or voters; it's come from the other side, and
right.
and that is the problem that I'm speaking of regarding the example that is set. So what hope is there? Because of course, as we approach this November election, there are so many things on the ballot: the fall of democracy, potentially the rise of Christian nationalism, a national abortion ban, a ban on contraception. I mean, who only knows?
Yeah.
But also, he's promised a Muslim ban, and with that comes the promise of more hate-filled, anti-immigration and anti-people of color rhetoric. So what do we do when the big guy is the one that's actually dog whistling and making these preposterous claims?
There's no snap of the fingers. There's no Thanos snap of the fingers where you have your magical infinity stones and you solve the problem. It's going to take activation and organizing. And James Baldwin talks about how I can't tell my children there's no hope. Right? I just can't look at them and say there's no hope in what you're doing. And so the work has to continue. And I tell folks that it's not just a matter of voting. I love sports. I watched every Bulls game in the 90s. I watched every game-winning shot Jordan hit, especially the last one, Game 6, 1998 NBA Finals against Utah Jazz over Brian Russell, right? To be specific. And I always point out that the championship wasn't won solely on that shot. That's what sealed it. But it was won with the hours put into the gym in the off season, the extra shots, the extra weights, the extra sprint drills. And democracy works the same way. Election day might seal the win, but the election is won by, are you knocking doors? Are you making phone calls? Are you donating money? Are you volunteering? Are you registering voters? There's so many things you can be doing, you need to be doing before election day to get there. And that is where the impact needs to be. I was talking to a young woman who had a brilliant idea, and she goes, look, if you're frustrated with the Democratic Party, if you're a young person and you're a liberal or a progressive and you're a Democrat and you're frustrated with the Democratic Party, most of these Democratic committees on the local level are run by 10 to 15 people. Grab 20 of your friends, show up to the next meeting, and vote in one of your friends as the person in charge, right, and then run the party the way it needs to be run. That's the role. If young people voted at the rate of their grandparents, we could flip every single election in this country. And so we know what the solutions are. It's a matter of building the coalition and then doing it consistently so that we can bring about that meaningful change.
Turnout was pretty dismal last time around, I think 68%. Yeah. I mean, how do you think turnout will be much higher, considering that people know what Donald Trump represents this time? Because remember, in 2016, people just thought he was the guy off the TV and, the guy from Home Alone 2. and then obviously in 2020, they knew exactly what he was about. disappearing people off the streets of Portland, gassing people in Lafayette Square, just for starters.
Yeah.
And so he didn't win. And I have great faith in the American people and their desire to live in a civilized, democratic nation. So I don't believe he can win personally, but that ultimately is down to the Electoral College, because as we know, that is a pretty rigged system, and the Republicans are relying on that rigged system to get success at the ballot box.
The fact that it's even a question right now is part of the problem, right? He's been convicted of 34 felonies. He's got 60 more to go, or 58 more to go, what have you. He's got 3 more criminal trials. He's been convicted of rape in civil court. He's been caught defrauding his university. His kids have been caught stealing from cancer charities. I mean, the list just goes on and on and on. It shouldn't be close. And that, again, goes back to what I think is within our control. We're not going to control Republicans, but on the Democratic side, it is within our control. And that's where my frustration is with some of our policies. We despise Trump's asylum ban. Biden ran on ending Trump's asylum ban. Biden has now implemented an asylum ban that the ACLU is suing the Biden administration. And in their words, we're suing him because his asylum ban is indistinguishable from Trump's asylum ban. Biden ended on ending the Muslim ban, and he did, which is great. But how many more Palestinian Muslims have been killed while Biden continues to provide arms, despite the UN, the ICC, and the ICJ all affirming that Israel is committing war crimes and is on the precipice, if not committing genocide? Our own Leahy laws aren't being upheld. And you can even argue that, well, those are fringe issues. That doesn't affect 30, 40, 50% of the Democratic Party. Okay, but from what I recall, Biden won by less than a combined 100,000 votes in the swing states. That's less than 0.1%. So if it impacts 0.1%, it's enough. And that's my concern in states like Michigan, what has a huge Arab American population, a huge Muslim population. How does he win that? States like Georgia, where it's already a pretty conservative state, and there has a large, Muslim population there as well. How is he going to win that? The Wisconsin delegates are telling Biden to stop arming Israel. These are the actual elected delegates to the DNC telling them stop arming Israel. It's affecting the vote. It's affecting turnout here as well. And I don't know if he's listening. So these are the things that I think about. These are the things that I'm trying to figure out. How do we get past this? And I don't know if I have an answer right now. What I'm doing...
Could the answer... Sorry to interrupt you, but could the answer be to explain that Trump would be far worse, and his position on Israel is kind of different to Joe Biden's, in as much as he wants Gaza decimated and wants to turn it into a parking lot and won't rest until every Muslim has been eradicated? I mean, that's the reality for Donald Trump. And you could say he'll have a similar position on Ukraine, annexing the Donbass or something and giving it to Russia. I mean, that's what we're dealing with.
But Anthony, I think the point is that when you say, and I don't mean you specifically, but when a person says Trump will be worse, well, if it's already a genocide, isn't that the threshold that we should already be opposed to? And I agree that Trump is a fascist and will hasten fascism into the country. I have no doubt about that. The point is, since that's so obvious, why are we sacrificing our democracy for Benjamin Netanyahu? Why are we sacrificing or risking installing a fascist for the Trump of Israel, right? In Netanyahu.
I have a theory.
Yeah.
And tell me if I'm wrong, but Trumpism it devalued America's power on the world stage.
Absolutely did.
And the US politically became a bit of a laughing stock, so much so that we actually saw European leaders laughing at him.
Literally laughing.
We saw the United Nations audience laughing at him. We saw, individuals at summits kind of whispering to each other about him. And so the US, I think, post Donald Trump, does not have the strength and the leverage on the world stage that it once did.
Great.
And,
yeah.
We see NATO currently scrambling to reposition their military in case Trump pulls the US out of the alliance. All of these things contribute to the reason, in my view, why Joe Biden isn't able to just snap his fingers and have this done with. Because Antony Blinken has not stopped in terms of his travels to try and bring about a peace, negotiations, a ceasefire. And, he keeps coming up against, it's Netanyahu invariably, who is the one that doesn't want to play ball. So what more can the US actually do?
There's a lot. I mean, I just think there's so much that we can do. I always go back to when Israel was invading Lebanon. Reagan made one phone call and stopped the bombing. And he even himself remarked, I didn't know I had that kind of power. Well, yeah. You do it. And look, I've been to Israel. I've been to occupied Palestine. I've spoken to Palestinian activists, to Israeli activists, to Israeli soldiers, to people high ranking, and they all tell me the same thing. Whatever happens here happens with U.S. approval. Simple as that. Like anybody, I've talked to people who's like, I've given tour guides to Nancy Pelosi. I've given tour guides to Mitch McConnell, to Newt Gingrich, to every politician left and right. And I can tell you, nothing happens here without the approval of American politicians. That's the first thing. Second thing is there's a reason why we have the Leahy laws. Right? These laws were passed after World War II to ensure that we are not arming countries that are credibly accused of war crimes, of crimes against humanity. And I want to be clear, credibly accused, not even a conviction, but credibly accused, because that's how sensitive we were to that. None of those laws are being upheld right now or protected. No.
We have they haven't been for a while. I mean, look at Saudi Arabia and Jamal Khashoggi, for example. I mean,
and Yemen, absolutely. You're exactly right. And so we can't talk about international rules-based order when we're not following up with it ourselves. We can't sit here and watch State Department spokespersons shed tears for Ukraine about how children are being bombed, and then for Palestine say, well, war is war. That's just what happens. It doesn't work that way, right? We're not dumb. We're human beings, and the same blood that's spilled for a Ukrainian child is as precious as an Israeli child, is as precious as a Palestinian child. And all we're saying is don't discriminate between them. Treat them all with the same love and compassion as you would your own child. And when we see the inconsistency there, that's where the problem is. And so I think President Biden needs to come out strong and say there's no contradiction between saying that Israel has the right to be a sovereign state and Israel also needs to be accountable to international human rights law. And as the United States, we will not be part of a country that does not respect international human rights law. That's not a hard statement to make. And I think that is one that is unassailable as well. And it was one that, in my view, will increase his voter turnout, increase trust and confidence in him. Where I'm flabbergasted is why he's not willing to say and act.
Well, as we're recording this, it's not been said. I mean, they have made certain references to it, and he has paid lip service to it. But I think that between now and the election, a lot will change, and I'm hoping that there will be a little more understanding. I suppose the natural allegiance for America as a kind of cultural phenomenon is because America was at the nucleus of the creation of the Jewish state of Israel. Sure. That there is a natural allegiance.
Sure.
And again, in the same way that the US didn't, or the founders didn't consider that Donald Trump would show up, that really the US didn't consider that Benjamin Netanyahu would be potentially on trial for corruption charges and hold the country to ransom. So, that's the...
Well, I almost think of it as they did anticipate a person like Trump showing up, but they didn't anticipate as a Congress who would be complicit.
Yes. Yeah.
That's kind of where we are.
Well, Benny Gantz quit a few weeks ago.
Yes.
And I think that is probably how this might play out. That Netanyahu will end up being isolated because the people that I've spoken to there, they don't believe that he represents the Israeli people.
I agree with that 100%.
He's doing his own work.
Yeah. I agree.
Okay, we have to finish, but I'm very pleased we were able to have that conversation and
Yes.
other tough conversations as well. It's always a pleasure. You are the most eloquent individual, and it's a real pleasure to talk with you. And I love your knowledge of history and of Mark Twain. So
Thank you.
all the very best to you, Qasim
All the
Rashid.
privilege to be here. Thank you for having me.
I'm Anthony Davis. Don't forget to support me and independent journalism at patreon.com/5Minute News. See more from me on the 5 Minute News YouTube channel. And I'll be back next Sunday with a brand new special guest and more factual news to discuss on the 5 Minute News Weekend Show with Midas Touch.